Hello, Internet. I'm Coraon, your witch in residence. And thankfully for October, I'm being blessed by getting some fantastic pagan authors to come in and talk about their views on the craft for Halloween this year. As you can see, we've moved away from the library and down into the lab. I felt a change of venue was appropriate just this time. And I'm going to bring in some wonderful people to speak with us today. Joining us today is Yvonne Aburrow. She's a fantastic author. Her 9th book, Pagan Roots, is going to be coming out this year. And without further ado, Yvonne, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah.
So you've wrote some incredibly in-depth work on not just the craft itself, but the culture that is springing up around paganism in general, and trying to fill in those gaps on the culture that is forming in terms of how we relate to other members of not just the craft, but other members who may not fit neatly into what would be considered the mainstream of society, and how to integrate things with a culture that's underpinnings were created in I want to say pre-Christianity Europe, but it goes even farther back than that. We can trace some of the original practices all the way back to Mesopotamia. So, so some of your work I've really enjoyed. I loved changing paths. It's not something that I necessarily was looking at doing, but as growing up in a Christian household and then discovering craft, it's almost like you're leaving an ex-spouse, and except for the difference is religion doesn't give you an opportunity to get closure when you're angry.
Yeah, for sure. I think people leave religions for all kinds of reasons, and it can be obviously it's kind of about my experience of leaving Christianity, but I wanted to make it so that it could be about leaving any tradition. There have been cases where there have been high control forms of paganism that people have had to leave. So, and typically the things that people bump up against are gender and sexuality. So, and also the religion's attitude to other religions and the expectations they might have about what aspects of your life they're going to control. So it was possible to kind of file the serial numbers off of it and go, okay, we're talking about the generic experience of being in a relatively high control religion, and how you go about disentangling yourself from that.
Now, to me, it seems a lot of your work has dealt with, consent and relationships and in general gender work inside of craft. I'll freely admit, in the coven I work with, this has come up on more than one occasion on how to integrate a religion that is primarily a fertility religion, designed around the concepts of a male priest and a female priestess working together in conjunction. We actually took the steps where, upon deciding on whether we're going to teach somebody, we ask them flat out, would you be looking to study as a priest, or would you be looking to study as a priestess? And then training specifically in that direction, not necessarily about gender, but in the role of priest and the role of priestess.
Yeah, I think that's one approach you can take. I mean, the way that I was trained, you don't really have to make everything gendered, and because if you're coming from the Long Island perspective, there's always that thing of the priestess must cast the circle and stuff like that. Whereas where the tradition I came up in, anybody can cast the circle.
How we tend to,
it is possible to kind of remove the gendered aspects of things to a very large extent. And that's, I mean, I understand that, you know, I think it's, if people want to keep the gender binary piece of their practice, then saying, you know, people can be the gender they are. So a trans person would join as the gender they are. But it doesn't really work for me because I'm non-binary. So
fair enough. No, well, that's kind of why we went with, you know, instead of referring to the gender, but referring to the title.
Yeah,
Of priest or priestess.
Where are you going with that? I know, but I mean, I think as a non-binary person, I can go either way, and so the way our practice has panned out is that we just don't really gender things, for sure.
So it's been a fun ride, really. Like, for example, what my wife and I do is, traditionally in Long Island, you are correct, it would be the priestess only that casts the circle. But because we have a bunch of other lines under our belt, we decided that for the light half of the year, my wife and priestess would cast the circle. And for the dark half of the year, I would.
Oh, nice. I like that. Yeah.
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 You know, it's just kind of a balance point, right?
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, I think in our case, it's like, all right, who wants to cast the circle today? So
yeah, we're still rather young. We have a bunch of students and some younger individuals in our group yet, so they're still getting to the point where we're willing to hand over the reins, but they're getting there very quickly. I'm actually pretty happy with them. So
great. It's a great time to. I like that phase. It's a nice phase.
Yeah, it's sweet, and you know, there's been some interesting pieces that have actually come up because of it, and some of them have actually boiled down to, well, you know, consent and how to make sure you're getting that consent part across.
Yeah.
And yet also not make it, for lack of a better term, weird, which I think is actually something that a lot of people in like the modern dating world even struggle with, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things that I tend to do. You know, I always appreciate it when someone says, do you do hugs, or are you hugging, or whatever, and I tend to do the sort of telegraphing thing. It's like, which may not be helpful, but like, I'm coming in for a hug.
Yeah, it's like the pagan hug dance, like you're not always sure, like
and then the other person can kind of go, no, get away from me. But kind of when you look like you're hovering for a hug, it may be too late. So I don't know, maybe explicitly asking is perhaps better. So,
yeah, I mean, you know,
I'm still working on it, you know.
Yeah, we tend to make it very clear to new people that, you know, we tend to be huggers, so if you're not, let us know now so that we don't just,
that works.
Right? Yeah. You know, it's a fun piece to talk about in a lot of ways, because there are some unique pieces that come up with the craft being a mystery religion, but not everyone having a partner that is necessarily part of that mystery religion.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that has come up in circles that I speak with is when you have a member that is getting ready to make the step to join the coven proper, and you have a partner that is, say, atheist or of another faith, that, you know, may not be comfortable not knowing all aspects of what goes on inside the coven. And
yeah, I mean, I think it's that is a tricky one. I haven't dated I haven't dated a non-pagan for quite a long time, because I kind of got to the point where I was like, oh, you don't know what my festivals mean to me, you know, and that was weird. So yeah, it was really important to me to have somebody who like could do stuff with me. Yeah, I think that's a tricky one, because it's about how far does that person trust their spouse, right?
Well, that's it.
And I mean, I know of situations where people are told that they can't even tell their significant other what religion they belong to, and I think that's a bit over the top, like.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to believe, like, I know, opening up a channel where I'm openly saying I'm the witch in residence on YouTube, kind of precludes me from having any sort of secrecy when it comes to my part of craft. But
Yeah,
I always view that as the choice of the individual.
for sure.
In
Yeah,
terms
I
of
mean,
that.
like, I feel like it would be really weird not telling your partner that
Right.
you are a Wiccan or a witch or whatever, but then as far as what goes on in the group, you kind of dispel their fears, like, no, it's okay, there's no orgies or whatever, and then beyond that, I think they just have to be, it's like if my husband goes out with one of his female friends for a drink, I'm not going to be thinking, oh, what could be happening, because I trust him, right? It's like
That's
that.
it.
But I'm actually going to put in a plug for somebody else's book.
Oh, please.
Which is Thorn Mooney has just released Witches Among Us, which is it's a book for people who want to know about witchcraft, and she's released some really hilarious videos of like standing at the window with binoculars, and she's like, now you don't have to stand at the window with binoculars because you can read my book. So I'm like,
Awesome.
she just completely upped the game for everybody for book promotion.
Well, thankfully, we're getting an opportunity to get you on here to promote your new book. But I will put in a link to Thorn's book in the description, along with, of course, your site and where everyone can find your books, which I found to be very insightful into some of the modern pitfalls of trying to work craft in the modern age, because there are a lot of challenging ones.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorites is I did a chapter in Dark Mirror on spiritual bypassing, which is that kind of thing where people go, oh yes, I am very serene and I have dealt with all my anger issues, and it's actually a way of kind of tone policing other people and telling people off for being angry or whatever. And it's like, have you looked at the state of the world recently? So I think that I was very pleased with the spiritual bypassing chapter, and also my other favourite is what I call the second coming of Aleister Crowley syndrome.
Yes.
Which is where it needs a catchier name. I feel it's a bit long, but it's basically where somebody kind of goes, right, I've got my initiation or I've got my elevation. Now I know everything. And I am the second coming of Aleister Crowley, and you can't teach me anything.
So around here, we've been referring to it as first degree itis.
Yeah, it can come up at second as well, but I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, that I've also heard it referred to in Hermetic circles as the neophyte's dilemma, where you've come so far that you're looking back at your accomplishments instead of looking forward to everything you now have ahead of you.
That person probably thinks, I am so magical. I know everything there is to know about the occult. Yes, but are you a nice person?
Well, there's that component too, right? Because no amount of knowledge can make you wise, right?
Yeah.
And no amount of intelligence can make sure that you're applying it correctly.
Yeah. I mean, the one simple golden rule of everything, don't be a dick.
Well, yes. All right. I mean, ultimately, I laughingly say, but it is true, that just about every religion tends to start with the concept of, look, try to be nice to each other, even though sometimes people are going to be terrible to you.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then it just changes to, well, what is nice according to your culture, followed by those guidelines becoming rules, those rules becoming dogma, right?
Absolutely. And and it's all too easy for any tradition to kind of get stuck in the era when it first arose. I mean, if you look at Wicca, Wicca was founded in the 1950s. Like, okay, maybe as far back as the 1920s, and sure, we have stuff that's ancient within that, but Wicca itself was very definitely either founded in the late 20s or in the 50s when Gardner got going, right?
I mean, we have
so it, as a religion that was founded in the 1950s, it took on the coloration of what was radical and transgressive in the 1950s. So, in the 50s, having gay people in the craft was unthinkable. So that wasn't even on their radar. And then, but at the time, having a woman in charge of the ritual, super radical, because women couldn't even have their own bank account and checkbook until 1974. I went to a talk once by Doreen Valiente, and she said, in the 1950s and 60s, you couldn't get a tarot deck. If you go to her book, I forget which book it's in, I think it's Witchcraft for Tomorrow, she actually has an appendix on how to use playing cards for divination, because there are no tarot decks widely available at the point when she wrote that, and that was in the early 70s. So,
and now there's so many tarot decks that I have people that are starting in the craft that go, there are 6 billion decks out there, which one do I start with?
Right? Yeah. But like, when you think about, I mean, even when I started I was initiated in 1991, right? Even when I started, you couldn't just run down the shop and buy an athame, or go on the internet and buy an athame, because there was no internet. You had to make your own stuff or repurpose ordinary stuff. So I think actually, there's sort of where I was going with all of this is that when you have, the religion kind of gets established, and this is what's radical, this is what we're doing to break away from whatever the previous thing was. And Wicca's big idea was the goddess and priestesses, right? So when we start to make the shift to LGBT inclusion, people are like, but you've got to have a priest and a priestess because that's equality. And I think part of the reason that there was initially a lot of pushback to the idea of same-sex initiation, or like people of multiple genders doing things or whatever, that people felt that balance would be lost. And the vast majority of people are still cisgender. It's really, we're actually talking about 40% of the craft, because there are so many LGBT people in the craft.
Well, it's because a lot of them didn't find a home anywhere else, right?
Yeah, because we're still the most open-minded thing in town, right? Or at least paganism in general is, But I think, a lot of people are still very wedded to this idea of the gender binary and how they want to kind of bring that in terms of symbolism and not just, we've got a man and a woman, but also the man corresponds to these qualities and the woman corresponds to these qualities. And so that's why I think it was kind of hard to shift that. And it's interesting because when I first released All Acts of Love and Pleasure Inclusive Wicca, talking about, well, do we have to stand male, female in the circle? And do we have to do everything? A man consecrates a woman and a woman consecrates a man. Do we have to do all of that? Can we think of other ways that we could do this? There was an awful lot of pushback. And now I'm coming up to I've actually started revising the book for a 10th anniversary edition. And I started putting out announcements like, hey, everybody, I'm doing this thing. And everyone's like, yay, fantastic. And so it's really interesting to see
how the culture has changed a little bit.
Culture has changed, but it's also a bit disheartening. A number of people have gone, well, actually, I've never read it. And I'm like, only the most seminal book on witchcraft in the entire century so far. Come on.
Now that might be your Aleister Crowleyism cropping up right there, though.
That there was a certain amount of tongue in cheek there, but
Well, yeah, of course.
I also, I do. I mean, it's been really, really interesting because a lot of LGBT people have written to me to say, that they thought the craft wasn't for them because they thought it was all about the gender binary, and they read my books.
Yeah.
And, oh, yay! I can be a witch. Good. I can be a Wiccan. So
yeah, I mean the most promising working partner couple that I'm working with right now, is a bi-female and a incredibly gay male, and they have a system that works for them where they are able to take that relationship, that deep spiritual friendship, if you will, and express that as their like almost brotherly and sisterly love in the circle, and that is the bond that they use.
That works
in ritual.
Cool.
Yeah, it works great, right?
Yeah.
It's I think it boils down to and this is something that is kind of percolated through my family, is that love is one of those super rare resources on this planet, and stifling it in any way, regardless of what kind it is, it should be seen the same way as people littering, right? Like, it's not a good thing for the universe.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. And it, the statement in the charge is all acts of love and pleasure are the rituals of the goddess, right? Not some of them.
Well, I mean, the joke that's always gone around our group is that, yes, all acts of love and pleasure are her rituals, up to and including the very, very kinky ones. But, it's, sometimes people are rules lawyers, and that's how it works.
Yeah, I mean, provided the kink is an act of love and pleasure,
that's it.
Both parties are enjoying it, then have at it,
That's it. And I think that's, and that kind of spiritual need to have some sort of deep connection, and not necessarily romantic love, but love in general.
Yeah.
Inside the group, right? I mean, we talk a lot about how, the coven really at the end of the day is a family, right? With, similar to family dynamics that wind up playing out despite how much you may fight that. Because let me tell you, being the high priest or high priestess and being in that mother-father role, not necessarily where you want to be in that situation, but inevitably winds up playing out like that.
I mean, it's interesting because I think you're right, but it's something that I've always resisted, in that I mean, I am also an anarchist, so not keen on hierarchy, and
I mean, we tend to run very egalitarian in that regard.
I think most people do, to be honest. But,
I mean, I've seen covens that don't, like, when a new person potentially comes along, they don't kind of like take a consensus on it. It's just whoever's decided it's their way or the highway kind of thing. But I've always preferred to run in a general consensus environment.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
And
I mean, I was quite heavily influenced by Starhawk, it has to be said. So.
Fair. I mean, I but it inevitably works out that, because high priest and high priestess typically have been at it for so long, they're at a very different point in their life instead of somebody starting out.
Yes. Well, so I mean, there's different types of authority, isn't there? There's like authority in the sense of being authoritarian, having power over, which is not what we want, because we're all grown-ups, right? At least we hope so. And then there's authority in the sense of, well, I know stuff, and I am teaching you the stuff. So,
but there's also
learning the stuff from me. Then I get the respect that's owed to somebody who's teaching you stuff, which means, show up on time, do the homework, like and also showing up on time is about respecting the time of the other people who are coming along to the group.
Well, I would also put it in the, like, okay, a lot of the students that we've taken on, they're at that early stage of adulthood where they've finished school or are in their like doctorate programs or what have you. And but they're still starting out, right? Like, they may have a couch someone else can crash on, which in my opinion is the definition of an adult, is you can take care of another adult for an extended period of time if needed.
That's a good definition. Yeah.
Right. But they're still dealing with stuff like, this is the first time they've owned a house and haven't necessarily run into this problem with the house. Oh, I bet my high priest has dealt with this with their house before. I should call them. Right? And that kind of, I find, also lends into a like almost paternal figure accidentally.
Yeah,
right.
For sure. I mean, I'm kind of coming at this because my high priestess was really keen not to be seen as a mother figure. So she made it like really clear, I'm the high priestess card in the tarot, and I am not the empress. I am the high priestess card, and that's my archetype, and don't you forget it. So I'm also kind of along those lines.
Fair.
I don't identify with maternal type thing. But it's interesting, like from a tarot perspective, the equivalent card to the male card to the high priestess card is the Hierophant, I guess. Yeah. And because that's got all that sort of Pope stuff tied up in it, Yeah. I mean, obviously the high priestess card is the Popess in older decks, but I think that the archetype of the Hierophant is more complicated, or more it's got more baggage attached to it, right? Than the
that's it.
So it's like, in terms of helpful, friendly archetype that will help people to understand what a high priest is and what a high priest does, you're going to end up with Dad, I think.
Yeah. I think a little bit.
I can totally see why you would end up like that. I think the one that I have difficulty with is when people say, well, I'm the dad of the coven, and my initial
that's
kids, and I'm like, oh, just stop there, like, please don't.
Yeah, that's a little weird. No, like, to me, I look at the mentor-mentee bond there as, it's not family per se, but it is definitely the voice of, I've fallen down these holes before you, and I'm desperately trying to talk you out of falling into them.
Right.
And hopefully you do. And I think in a lot of cases, the mentee tends to get grateful enough eventually that they appreciate that wisdom a lot more. And will reach out for that kind of advice in non-craft related things.
Yeah. Well, I also think that, if you're a person who, some people like to take life difficult, and they will go, all right, I don't need your advice, I'm going to go and do the thing, whatever it is. And I'm going to find out the hard way. And then other people like to go, hey, person who may have been there before, can you fill me in on the details of this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I've said to my students, I will warn you against falling down the cliff, but if you decide to do it anyway, I will be laughing the whole way you're falling down.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Because, I mean, sometimes people do have to fall down those cliffs to learn the lesson.
Yeah.
And that's okay too, because sometimes the lesson is how you pick yourself up from it.
Yeah. I always like my sort of persistent image of dadhood in a way is the whole thing of your dad like taking you down to the park with your bike for the very first time you get on a bicycle, and holding on to the saddle while you pedal furiously, and then he lets go, and you don't know exactly the moment when he let go, and you were cycling.
Yeah.
I think it's like that.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that I don't think a lot of people really understand about craft, because this doesn't happen in other religions, is part of our whole thing is getting somebody through those formative years of study, getting them to the point where they are mastering their craft. And then once they've reached a certain point of mastery, saying, okay, it's time for you guys to go and start your own journey like we had to. Right? It's time for you to work without a net. Well, you're always welcome to come back and talk with us. But it's time you go.
Yeah. And that's a weird time as well, because
right?
You're kind of waiting for them to realize that you can fly now. Off you
right.
go.
And it's fascinating because we joke around in our group saying that you can always tell when somebody's getting ready for that point when they start having opinions like, I might have done that differently, right? But I'm going to respect people enough to let them do it and then ask the questions afterwards why exactly you did it this way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's valid. But yeah, I think there's also that great point that you get to when everybody's working on the same level and you're working as peers. That's a great feeling too. But I think the difference with Wicca is that everybody in Wicca is a priest or priestess or priestix in their own right. So they're like, in other religions you've got the priesthood and then you've got the laity. We don't have a laity, do we? So once you're first degree, to me, when you're first degree, you're a priest to yourself. So you're obviously there are other people around you with more experience and they're going to help you develop those skills. But, first degree initiation, you're a priest or a priestess or a priestess.
It's actually interesting you mentioned that.
Second, you're a priest or you're a priestix to the other people in the group. And then when you get to third, you're priestix for the whole community.
Well, it's actually interesting you would mention that because Toronto is actually very unique in the world, other than I think there's 3 other cities that have something similar to this, where there actually does exist a pagan laity tier, if you will, in the craft, only because they decided to take things more public and offer an open public writ that ran routinely.
Yeah.
And it's been an interesting experiment so far. And it's produced some unusual and really surprising results, because you wind up with this kind of, I want to almost call it an underclass that never really takes the option of further study, but is quite knowledgeable in their own right.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting model. And I think that, obviously there's always eclectic pagans and then there are other pagan traditions that have, but with Druidry as well, for example, like...
Druidry absolutely has a laity and it's fascinating.
Yeah, but the thing... I don't know about ADF Druidry, which is more common version in North America, but but OBOD, which is more common in the UK, has you come in, you become a bard, so you're already on the
path.
You're on the priest path, right? And then you get ovate, and then you get druid. So they don't call it like priest and the way we do, but that's absolutely what they're doing. And it's not really surprising because Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols used to hang out together. So.
Well, that's it, right? My other degrees come from the Hermetic side of things, and they have, there's a lot more strictly defined roles in between the degrees, if you will. And because of that, you wind up having a very good idea of where somebody's achievement so far has gotten. So it really, sometimes when dealing with the larger pagan community, it can almost feel like a Wild West of sorts, where you're trying to kind of suss out somebody's level of training so you don't inadvertently, get into concepts that would just be beyond the person at that point in their training, right?
Yes, I mean, it's obviously easy in Wicca because you just go, are you second yet? Because then I won't talk about certain things.
Well, yes, but there's also this... Okay.
Spoil the surprise.
You don't want to spoil the surprise, but there's also another interesting piece about it where you have... I'll give you a textbook example. One of the traditions I have is basically you get initiated at first degree more or less, and then your training begins.
Right.
But there are other traditions that I have under my belt where there's extensive training before first, to the point where as a first degree, you are prepared, of course under supervision though, to be able to run a ritual on your own and have all the knowledge and skill set necessary to be able to do it. Right? I mean, you should still, of course, have, a senior member of priesthood, keeping an eye on you kind of thing. But you have that knowledge available to you right then and there.
For sure.
So they're even saying, well, I'm a first degree, you kind of have to sit there going, okay, well, who trained you?
Yeah.
Right?
This is true. Yeah, I mean, and if somebody says that's why knowing people in the community is such a beneficial thing, because you go, all right, that person trained you, therefore I know that you're not going to know this, and this.
Well, yeah.
And it's also why, like, there is no kind of standard training across different groups, so you're going to end up with
no, and I think in a lot of ways that's a good thing.
Oh yeah, for sure, because different people will train about what they think is important. So I mean, that's one of the reasons I think I wrote Pagan Roots, because I bring up in my training a lot of concepts like cyclicity and reincarnation and struggling now, like the concept of immanence, the idea that the divine is immanent in the world, and people don't learn about these concepts, and if they're
necessarily,
and then there's a whole bunch of other concepts where people only really know the Christian understanding of that concept. So so the book is actually divided into like two separate bits. The first bit is, well, there's 10 chapters with an overview of, well, this is what I think paganism is about, and then there's a reclaiming of words that people think, oh, that's not a pagan word, we don't do that. So things like prayer and virtue and theology, which some people really struggle with those words. And then the last bit is, okay, now we're going to talk about the words that people think of as pagan, but maybe they use them in a weird way, like tradition being the obvious one.
Right.
I feel like this will, it sort of started at life as, okay, we're going to reclaim these concepts. And then I thought, this is going to be a really lopsided book if I just reclaim concepts that people think of as not pagan. So then I had to sort of bring in the other side for balance, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, Changing Paths is going to be an important book to read before Pagan Roots in that regard.
Yeah.
Because I think coming to terms with your life before craft is going to be very critical to understanding, that it's okay for certain terms to exist within craft.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think people have to deal with their unexamined baggage, which is a chapter title in Changing Paths, and get over that and get into the pagan worldview. So in a way, Pagan Roots is a sequel to Changing Paths for sure.
Yeah, I think they're going to be very, very handy companion books for somebody starting out.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. I mean, based on what I've seen so far, I haven't had a chance to read Pagan Roots yet because it's not out yet, but hopefully we'll be getting it soon.
Yes,
And
January 2025.
January. Well, that is so kind of you to offer me such a lovely birthday gift. I appreciate it.
Yes.
But yeah, this is this work is important stuff for people to understand, because even if you are an absolutely staunch traditionalist in how you view craft, we're in a world that is very different than when those traditions were set down.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are ways to adapt what we've come from to the world we live in today.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I was for years running a course on how to integrate technological devices into how you operate craft, because one of the things that I always had trouble with was running ritual in a dorm where you're not allowed open flame and you're not allowed incense.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how are you supposed to set up a ritual space? And I came up with a bunch of options and a bunch of ways to do this, that, and the other thing, and how to make it not so obvious to your, incredibly orthodox roommate what exactly is going on in the room while they're gone.
I like it. Also, we live in Canada. The houses are made of wood.
Well, there's that too, right?
Like, I don't want to accidentally set fire to my house and me while I'm in it.
Well, there's that piece. I would also argue that there's the piece of, we live in not just Canada, but the southern part of Canada. So there our houses are built very, very well for keeping in heat, which can be great in the winter. But if it's in the summer and you're running a candle-heavy ritual, it can get very warm in that room very quickly.
Well, thank goodness we have basements.
Right?
Because our basement is basically cut out of rock. So it's kind of, it's pretty cool most of the time, which means get the heaters out in winter and
to set up ritual space.
And then it's naturally like a cave in summer, so it's perfect.
Yeah, there's also the I want to call it the pagany proclivity for picking ritual vestments that are heavily inspired by like vaguely Renaissance era wear. Which means that while we are a very beautiful people, we tend to be a very flammable people as well.
There is that. So, I mean, that's a good argument for Skyclad ritual, I have to say.
Well, there is that piece, but there's also the inclination to have those very long sleeves that are very easily caught on candles.
I've had Alexandrians tell me that they've got a ritual gesture, which is push the sleeve back, push the sleeve back.
Yep. I actually built my ritual robe without sleeves. Smart. For just such a reason.
Yes. Well, I have a like a dress thing that in case of rituals with robes. I have a dress that I bought from Mark's Workwear, so can't get much more Canadian than that.
Right. There was also the speaking of the traditional pieces, I actually wound up causing a fair bit of controversy in one of my first covens, because it said specifically that the ritual cords had to be these colors, but it never said what the cord material had to be. So when I heard I had to build this, I said, well, what am I talking about with these cords? And they go, well, you basically use it as a belt. I said, okay, great. And ordered a whole bunch of chainmail. And the links were just the right colors.
Yeah.
Right? And everyone kind of went, oh, okay. And then I specifically started going, well, how exactly is there a specific rules in anywhere that says specifically how you are to wear your cords? And they said, well, no. So I spent an entire year of rituals finding different ways to wear it. Everything from as a sash to a headband to you name it, I found a way to do it. And the idea was, I wanted to make it very clear and very aware to people that there's more than one way to still stay within the confines of the tradition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I feel you do that very wonderfully in a lot of the options that you propose in the book.
Yeah.
For how to modernize pieces where you can still keep to the traditional flavor, but acknowledge that the world has changed.
Yeah.
And we need to change with it and evolve. And one of the things that, specifically one of the lines that we both belong to is very good about is pragmatism.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? That we figure out ways to go with the flow of what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
So let's go on with what goes on in the world and find solutions that are going to work, at least on a coven basis. And when we see they work and we've got evidence of them working, share it out to other groups that may be struggling with that idea.
And that's basically the impetus behind the book, pretty much.
Right. So
it's also, I think, people kind of say things like, well, what if I used Caster Square and used electric candles or something, right? That was a farcical hypothetical put forward by a certain individual, and the point is that there would be no reason to do that. The reason that we're saying, use different words for cakes and wine is because there's a reason to change it, which is to include everybody. And incidentally, the lover and beloved words for the cakes and wine were created by a lady called Crow Dewhurst, who I recently got back in touch with. So I'm giving her credit for that wherever I go, because I didn't know that when I wrote All Acts of Love and Pleasure, the inclusive Wicca. So anyway, so we're doing these changes or these expansions. They're usually like an expansion of the existing practice, because that way you include more people. It's not just like an arbitrary decision to do that. And I don't see people complaining when somebody says, oh, we could do this, we need to do this thing differently because some of the coven are getting older and they can't necessarily adopt that. They can't stand like this for half an hour or whatever it happens to be.
Or you've got people in the coven that have mobility issues, and they may not be able to stand for the entire time.
Yeah. And so I mean, one of the things that my first sort of piece of inclusive practice was, I was very fortunate in that my high priestess didn't make me copy the Book of Shadows out by hand, for which I'm eternally grateful. I do have a lot of hand copied rituals, but that was my choice. And I then initiated several people who are dyslexic, for whom it was very difficult to copy it out by hand, because you've got to go, okay, read it off of this thing here, try to remember the weird archaic thing that I've just read.
The weird squiggly,
and the weird squiggle, and transfer it to this other thing over here. The small working memory that a dyslexic person has makes it difficult for them to do that. So if you have to get people to copy stuff out, at least let the dyslexic people make a recording of the Book of Shadows, right? And also, from a learning and teaching point of view, I maintain that copying things out by hand is not the best way to learn the material unless you are a visual learner.
Well, I mean, it's certainly the traditional way to do it, is that all Books of Shadows are supposed to be written out in your own hand. But
right, but what is your own hand these days? It's one of these,
right?
Well, my hand of right these days,
Well, what we did was, so my high priestess is actually in British Columbia and I'm in Ontario. It's quite the journey.
Yeah.
And to get our second degrees, we went out there. And we were only out there for 4 days. Okay? We have 4 lines at least from our high priestess. So there are 4 different Books of Shadows.
Yeah.
So there are 2 of us trying to get 4 Books of Shadows done. And I don't know if you've ever seen anything remotely resembling the Long Island line, but the book is like,
They call that the forklift of shadows, right?
Yeah, it's we joke around saying that if you were to drop it on the maiden, you'd most likely squish her.
Yeah.
Sure. And we actually wound up in a situation where what we did was we were given. Now I'm pretty quick on it, despite the dyslexia, I'm very, very fast at copying. But what we wound up actually doing is arranging so that we would be on a direct stream when we got back, and she would put the pages up on screen and we could copy it by hand there.
Yeah, that also works. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we had to, because there was just no other way to do it. And it was a modern accommodation to how we had to handle it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, yeah.
But anyway, that was one of my first inclusive things. And then, but the thing that's interesting is that I've been saying for 25 years now, like, come on, people, why are we making people copy books of shadows out by hand? And here's the reasons why I don't think we should. And like, I might as well be shouting into the wind, to be perfectly honest. And then, but people will make accommodations for older people and people with mobility issues quite happily. And then when you say, oh, I think we should change this bit for LGBT people, and they go, no, what about the tradition? And it's like, well, okay, so you'll accommodate people who are older, and maybe if you're really enlightened, you'll accommodate people with mobility issues. So why wouldn't you accommodate, people who are neurodivergent in some way, and also LGBT people? Which leads me to kind of wonder if the people who are saying these things might just be a bit homophobic.
Well, okay. To provide a interesting counter argument to that line of logic, right? If one is when you're talking about mobility issues and you're talking about potential learning issues, right? They are things that, at the very least, the Canadian government would consider a disability. Yeah. I would never consider someone's sexual orientation a disability.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying...
Well, you know what I'm saying, though, but that would be the counter argument, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but I think so my argument is that if something is an intrinsic and permanent attribute of a person, right?
Yeah.
Then that should be accommodated. And if it's, like, for instance, if somebody is disabled, that's probably an intrinsic and permanent state.
True.
Unless, and not every disabled person would see that as a negative or a detriment anyway.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and then being LGBT is clearly intrinsic and permanent.
True.
And so, if our practice excludes those people, then
right, which, I mean, I personally don't think it ever should, but
yeah. And I think that, so it's interesting that what I'm kind of saying is that some people seem to be fine with accommodating some groups and not others.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, personally, the way I look at it is, I'll give you another really great example that there was a fair bit of controversy when this started. I was part of a coven that 85% of the coven was also in AA.
Right.
And so having ritual wine was a deep concern for a lot of the members. So we actually went back to original sources and actually went back to Vivian. And the question got asked, why are we actually using wine?
Yeah.
Right? And it turned out the reason why is because it's transformative, right? It's representative of the transformation within, and a little bit of a kick helps. Yeah. So then we made the argument, okay, so then why aren't we using something like ginger tea?
Yeah. Equally good. Yeah.
And because we're like, it has a kick and it is transformative.
Yeah. So the one I've heard is that because the yeast was alive, that there had to be something living, and there's presumably some yeast still surviving in the wine.
Ginger, again, still works the same logic, right?
Yeah, I guess. But anyway, that was the argument I heard, and I've heard the must have a kick argument as well. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about in Inclusive Liquor is, you know, if you're in that situation, it's more important to have a cup that everybody can drink from, unless you're doing COVID protocols, in which case you have a jug and several smaller cups. But, you know, it's more important to have, symbolically to me, it's more important to have a vessel that's consecrated, and then everybody drinks that same liquid out of that vessel, whatever it is. So we were actually in a situation like you described. So we tried chocolate milk, because chocolate is fermented.
Yep.
And then there was somebody who's like, oh, I don't like milk. And then we tried kombucha, and there was somebody who didn't like kombucha. And then
that would have been me in that camp.
Yeah, it's weird stuff. And then we also tried like yogurt drinks.
Okay.
And in the end, we settled on apple cider because
that works.
Because nobody hated apple cider, so it was. But yeah, you know, I think you absolutely did the right thing, which is, okay, what are we trying to achieve with this piece of tradition? And
that's it.
And then can we achieve that aspect of the practice in another way? Or is another aspect of the practice, like all drinking out of the same cup or jug or whatever, more important, in which case ditch the alcohol and drink something else? So
yeah, I mean,
and different covens will come up with different solutions.
Yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate in our group because you know, we have a general philosophy of everything involved in ritual should be made by the hands of the people involved in the ritual. So for example, we make our own candles. We you know, we're very lucky to have somebody that does glass etching in our group, right? And you know, makes chalices, right? I've done metalworking before, so we can do all those pieces for ritual, right? You know, we basically went, okay, let's figure out how to make our own wine. Let's figure out, you know, we bake our own bread for it, and every little piece like that. And you know, when it comes time to make the craft tools, that's part of the training, in our opinion, is you should be able to do this on your, you know, be able to at least have the knowledge to know how to do this.
Nice.
Even if you're not necessarily going to do that for your own personal tools, you've got something you like way better, you should have the knowledge to be able to do it on your own.
Cool.
And you know, through doing that, we had to do a lot of sit down and research on, you know, original sources and looking at how this was all originally done and why it was done that way, so that we can provide that information so that somebody can create something that is unique for themselves and an expression of their belief, their faith, how they want to do things, but within the confines of the general concepts.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's really good. I mean, so similarly with working out, like, okay, we're going to propose a different way of doing this practice, whatever, you know, invocation or consecrations or whatever. Okay, why are we doing it this way, and what is it we're trying to achieve, and can we still achieve that whilst slightly tweaking the practice?
Right.
And you know, I think I was quite careful in going, okay, I didn't necessarily unpack it with every single thing, but you know, when I was thinking about how I was going to modify things, I was like, okay, I'm going to think about, what is this practice for? What is it that doesn't work for LGBT people or dyslexic people or other neurodivergent
what have you,
or whatever? Yeah. And then how can we change it without losing the intent and the spirit of the practice. And I think a lot of people don't actually realize the thought that went into that.
Well, it's critical to the work, right? Because you want to. The interesting dichotomy of Wicca is it's the argument that it's, an ancient religion that started in like 1956, right? It's the idea of we're keeping to centuries old tradition, but we're trying to also keep in mind that it was created in a more modern world and it has to exist in a modern time.
Yeah.
It can't hold to, earlier belief systems that didn't allow for the world we live in currently.
Yeah.
And that's not to say whether we approve or disapprove of the world we live in, but has much more to do with the reality of we are living in this world. We need to accept that as much as we accept, the people that are willing to take this journey and, walk that fragile path that is craft. And how do we support each other in that? And I think
it's a dilemma for every religion, right? I mean,
well, yeah.
And some religions have been very deliberate in how they've gone about making those tweaks. Like the Quakers are very deliberate and very systematic in how even though their practice is quite simple, they've worked out a theology of same-sex marriage and gone, right, we're doing same-sex marriage, we're including LGBT people. Okay, we're going to put forward a theology of why that's the thing.
Right.
And that's really cool because...
Well, I mean, they made the logical jump that they had to adapt, right?
Yeah.
I mean...
far earlier than most other, they did it in 1966. They brought out their first report on including gay people, and the Unitarians weren't far behind because they were 1970. And most other Christian denominations didn't really start getting to grips with stuff till about 20 or 30 years later.
If that. And I mean,
and
then
they still haven't.
And I mean, and then you've got the Jewish side of things, which has made me laugh to no end because, one of our very close people, came out to their family. And then very shortly later, I think it was within a few days of it, the mother had already, was already trying to set her up with some of her friends' female daughters. And it was just no. The tradition of we setting you up with, with people is still happening. It's just now we know what your preference is, so we're going to make sure we fix towards that.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it.
We're going to find you a nice Jewish girl to settle down with because we still want grandkids. Right?
Yeah. That's very cool. I love it. Yeah, I mean, I think Judaism's adapted pretty well to.
Yeah.
But again, depends on the flavor. But
of course, right? I mean,
let's face it, every religion has a fundamentalist wing. So
that's it. And I think a lot of us are doing the best we can to temper the fundamentalist elements by allowing them to still do their thing, but making sure that they are aware they do not speak for everybody.
Yeah, and if only that's the thing. I think that unfortunately there's a very small, very vocal minority of and very loud minority of Gardnerians who are trying to say that they are traditional, and they're actually a tiny minority. And the people there are lots of people who are still practicing, pretty gender binary craft, but they're happy for people to say, right, okay, well, I'm a trans woman, so I'm a priestess, or I'm a trans man, so I'm a priest.
Yeah,
that's how they roll, and that's great. And it's interesting how the self-styled traditionalists who are giant transphobes can't even handle that, but they are in a tiny minority, and they're making themselves look very stupid.
Well, I mean, it's always an interesting piece, right? I mean, you have the I like to refer to it as almost the generations in craft, because you really see it in craft. I don't think I've seen it as clearly in other religions as you see it in craft, where you have the older generation, which I lovingly refer to as the old grognards, right? That have been running things, like they're at the point now where they were actually running things for a while, and now they're looking at the horizon and seeing retirement in that window.
Mm-hmm.
And they're slowly coming to terms with the fact that they're going to be phasing out, and that next generation that has just started to kind of take over authoritative roles in the community coming up. And these are the people that are I guess you would almost call them Gen X now, that have grown up with queer individuals being friends, relatives, or themselves for their entire life.
I think they're probably Generation Z.
Well, I mean, I've still got some very wonderful, very, very wise individuals beyond me still that are still kind of playing puppet master a little bit. I'm just coming into that authority now, and I mean, I've always been used to having queer individuals around. It's just part of the background culture, if you will.
Yeah.
And making sure that things work, but also respect the traditions is, to me, kind of an important piece, right?
Sure. But I mean, I also like to ask people, like, okay, what do you think tradition is? Because, tradition is, I did something, it was great, it worked for me. I write it down, I pass it on to the next person. They write it down, they go, oh yes, this works for me. They write it down, they pass it on to the next person, and so on down the generations. And eventually it gets to the point where somebody goes, well, actually it doesn't quite work for me, but if I tweaked it like this, it would work for me.
Right. And then
all traditions evolve like that, and people don't, because it changes quite slowly, everybody except folklorists and anthropologists tends to think that tradition is somehow set in stone and it was written down in 1970, so you've got to do it exactly like that. And it's like, no, people change traditions all the time, even in very high ritualistic religions like Catholicism. There are examples where people change stuff to include more people. Not necessarily in the ways that we would change stuff to include more people, but they do.
They do.
And it's like, so tradition, people are more important than tradition. Tradition is good one of the functions of tradition is that it helps us to understand, is this just my ego talking that's saying I don't like this thing? Say for example, you ask me to go home and meditate on the 4 elements every night for a month as part of the training, right? Because that's the tradition, and obviously there's a good reason to meditate on the 4 elements every night for a month, because it will help you to understand the elements and your relationship with them. So that's great. So that's a tradition that works for most people. If you then go, and I want you to ascribe particular gender roles to the elements, and then somebody comes along and goes, well, those gender roles that you said didn't work for me, that's when you might kind of tweak things. But it's still the same tradition.
What we actually have a tendency to do is when something like that happens, we go, okay, why? Yeah. And then we go through it and we discuss it. And I mean, we tend to use, instead of gender roles, we tend to use more the language of force and form.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. Yeah.
Right? Like that's what we tend to use,
yeah,
right?
I like force and form. Force and form are good. I think,
or active and passive is another one that we use a lot as well.
somebody told me recently that yin and yang, and I really love.
I mean, now I'm going to be honest. I actually don't like that one.
Yeah, but here's the thing. You will like it when I've told you this thing, which is amazing and cool, right?
Okay.
So yin and yang originally meant the shady side of the hill and the sunny side of the hill.
Yes.
And I really like that because it completely takes the gender out of it.
No, the reason why I don't like it is not because of the gender aspects, but because I tend to limit my craft to the European religions and North African, the pre-Christian European religions and pre-Christian, right? No, using an Asian influence, well, actually I believe it's Taoist specifically, influence symbolism to me is not what I should be doing as part of my craft.
No, I don't do it in ritual, but it's a concept that everybody knows and people get hung up on what it means. So if you tell them, oh, actually it just means the shady side of the hill and the sunny side of the hill, it's really helpful to kind of decouple it from the gendered bit. But no, I don't do that. I don't mention yin and yang in ritual because it would be cultural appropriation, right?
Well, I mean, cultural appropriation in itself is a challenging one because when you actually take a look at the word, right, the word's cultural appropriation, right? Culture as a French root and appropriation a Latin one, so we're already appropriating the term.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Right.
I think culture was probably originally Latin too, but anyway, that is a whole new can of worms, which we've got time for.
True. So I do want to thank you very, very much for coming out and chatting with us. I'm going to put a copy of your website and where we can order your books into the description below. Guys, please come check out her work. It's absolutely fascinating and worth a read. Even if you're not necessarily on a pagan-y path, Changing Paths is definitely worth a read. Even if you're only just looking at within your own belief set, going to a different version of that belief set, it can definitely help you work through why you're changing and how to do so without a lot of the pain and hangups that can come from that. Yeah. So I really do recommend her work. It's worth reading. And who knows, you might pick up some of the fascinating pieces that we've been discussing here. Yvonne, once again, thank you so much for coming out and joining us here today. And do you have any upcoming events that you'd like to plug, or?
I do not, in fact, but check out my YouTube channel as well as website, and I recently created a whole series of videos on the runes. So check those out. And I also have Beginner's Guide to Paganism and lots of videos about inclusive Wicca for anybody who wants to learn more about that. And yes, funny you should mention that about Changing Paths, because I got some Unitarians to read it as well, and they commented that it would work equally well if you were changing from, a religion to it. Just because the second half talks about paganism doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't use it to approach it as a guideline for approaching other traditions as well. So
yeah. So say, for example, from going from a Baptist Catholic to a Roman Catholic, it works just as well.
For sure. Yeah. It's all about okay, you're joining this new community, or you joined a new community and it's all shiny and you're all excited, but actually the new community still has, it still consists of people, and people can be difficult sometimes.
Very true. Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, I tend to end off all my videos the same way. And you're probably going to be very familiar with it. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. Take care, everybody.